In northern Utah, my great grandfather worked alongside Native Americans, who I believe were of the Shoshone Nation, to harvest sweet cherries, apricots, peaches, and apples. I enjoy learning about the rich culture of our Native people, especially their reverence for our natural resources. I have always had the utmost respect for Native Americans, and it is my pleasure to introduce Miss April Taylor, who is a tribal liaison for the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. April received her bachelor's degree from Texas A&M University in marine science and a master's degree from the University of South Carolina in earth and environmental resource management. As a Chickasaw citizen with a family tradition of Native American grafted pecan trees, she is inspired by helping the tribes manage and plan for the many environmental impacts of climate variability and change. April works with the goal of building research relationships with the 68 tribes in the South Central region. She is actively involved with the training and development of resources for tribal health and vulnerability assessments. I am very eager to hear her unique Native American perspective on climate change and its impact on culturally significant plants. Welcome, April.
Thank you, Josh. So I should be able to just share my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. How's that?
Perfect, we can see it.
All right. Well, so the title of my talk today is Losing Native Nations Culturally Significant Plants Due to Climate Change. And so we'll go ahead and get started. So Josh just introduced me. So I'm gonna just go forward. I will just say that I am a Chickasaw Nation employee, and I'm officed at the University of Oklahoma here in Norman, Oklahoma. So I serve as a tribal liaison for climate change. And so these are some of the things that I do. So we provide climate information or technical assistance. We provide climate trainings for tribal staff, and we've actually done 60 trainings in 10 years. We do a lot of youth outreach. And so we go out to Native communities and do festivals and after school programs and camps and do education and work with Native teachers. We also mentor Native students. I actually have 7 Native students here that work with me this semester. We advertise a lot of the tribal climate related meetings and opportunities to attend events. We help identify funding sources. We also have funding available. And then we often partner on projects as well. And all of this we offer for free to tribes. A little bit about my program. So we have a tribal engagement program, and the way I talk about it is we have these 3 arms: the workforce development arm, which I just mentioned, the Native youth outreach and the college students that work for us, the building capacity arm, which is the trainings, and then the research arm. And so we partner with tribes on research projects, and so we bring, I refer to myself as a matchmaker. I bring tribal staff and researchers together to work on projects and go after funding. And then I also do trainings and coach researchers on ethical research with tribal communities as well. So today, I wanted to sort of start off with some context. There are 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States today, but there are a lot more that used to be that were present in the United States. And so there are state recognized tribes, there are non-recognized tribes. And so there's quite the number of tribes that were present in Florida and in the Southeast US as well. And this is just a map showing what that was pre-settlement. So I wanted to start out talking about what are culturally significant plants. And I will just say that there is intentionally not a standard definition that, as you can imagine, with all those 573 tribes, that it varies from, tribe to tribe. And so a lot of the definitions you'll see are definitions like this one, about and where they're more broad. So talking about relationships with people, and that they, so a lot of times they'll be in reference to NAGPRA and the National Register for Cultural Sites and Cultural Properties and things like that. You'll see things like this language about past and present cultural traditions. And then related to a cultural group's identity. And we'll talk a little more about that as well. But this is one of the definitions that you might find that's out there. But when you talk to a tribal community, they may not have a definition of culturally significant plants or way of defining it. It's really embedded in their way of life, in their culture, and everything that's around them, right? And it's not something that's separate from their day-to-day activities. So it's, in our medicines, in our ceremonies, in our foods. It's embedded in who we are as a people, and there's all sorts of different uses. So here we have stickball sticks that are made out of the hickories. We have flutes that are made out of different woods. You have river cane flutes. You have, so depending on the culture, of what their flutes are made out of, different foods. So this big pot here is a dish we call pashofa with the Chickasaw Nation. And so that varies from tribe to tribe of what species, what plants are used. And it's really based off of, their location, their places. And so, as you were probably familiar, many of the tribes in the US were relocated, but their culture is still based off of where they originally were, their homelands. And so for the Chickasaw Nation, we were a Southeastern tribe in Mississippi primarily area, but we had a footprint and villages around 9 different states in the Southeastern United States. And so when it comes to consultation and interest in, we're interested in those 9 states, and you have to consult with us for all of those states. And that includes the culturally significant plants of that cultural landscape. I wanted to also bring up some other definitions here. So thinking about cultural heritage and what that means, and that it is, there's these intangible attributes, of spiritual or our ceremonies or, our religions and practices that as well. And so it's not just the plant itself, but the place it is, and there's a lot of other aspects to the culture of the respect of that plant and how that plant's managed as well. So another definition is cultural resources. So the South Central Climate Adaptation Center, we work in natural and cultural resources. And so when we talk about cultural resources, again, we're talking about not just the tangible, the plant itself, but the intangible, the spiritual, the secular, natural, created, and range in age from ancient times to present day. And so it often, of a historical presence on the landscape, and many of these tribes, practiced cultural resource management in some form. Another definition is traditional ecological knowledge, or as a lot of colleagues refer to as TEK. Is really about that knowledge about that plant and the environment around the people and their place, right? And so these communities and their elders and this knowledge is passed down from generation to generation. And, you know, things like seed preservation and biodiversity, and they, you know, they traded these things and have a lot of knowledge of these plants over time and since their millennia, since their origins, that has been passed down. And then keeping in mind that often a lot of these things are referred to in the sense of preservation. So an act of keeping the cultural and heritage from the present for the future. And so that is a definition that is in reference to a lot of the cultural resource managers, in that they're trying to maintain a current or a reference condition, which becomes an issue when we talk about climate change, when that might not be obtainable or realistic. So a little more context from the Native nations. So they do have their sovereignty and self-determination. And so when working with tribes, you know, they determine what that looks like for their community. So there are key acts, such as the National Heritage Protection Act. And most tribes have a tribal historic preservation officer of some kind that maintains their cultural properties and cultural sites. And then today, there are more and more tribes that are have a special designation of cultural properties called TCPs, traditional cultural properties. And that's a tribal property designation that they have chosen to put something under protection. A little more, so there are, you know, thinking about that they work with historical structures and grave protection, and we have cemetery crews. Many of these cultural resource staff work on their languages and preserving their language. And many of these tribes, especially the ones that we're talking about in the Southeast that were relocated, have really focused on revitalizing their culture or maintaining their culture. And another aspect is the tribes often have access to the federal property. So like the US Forest Service or the National Park Service, they can gather and have access to culturally significant plants and things on those properties. From another aspect is when we talk about tribal horticulture or natural resource or environmental departments. So again, tribes have staff that are working and have the capacity to work in these areas. And so often these types of departments play the role where they're doing the education about culturally significant plants. So maybe it's about, you know, planting a plant or seeds, or you know, a lot of what you talk about with foods, you know, they'll deal with the education around what our culturally significant plants are for which foods. They do a lot of the, many of tribes and tribal orgs do a lot of focus on seed banking, which, you know, historically, you know, tribes, this is not a new concept for them. They did seed banking and seed sharing, again, since their origins, and those seeds are often passed down through the family lines and things. And so this has been an area where we see tribes really taking the lead, and a lot of even the native plants. And so having seed sources and seeds available, and knowing a lot of that knowledge about how to germinate and plant some of the native plants that are often hard to find in on the market. They focus on providing these seeds for their culturally significant plants and their foods to their citizens. So they have programs often where they're trying to give these out to their communities, to their elders, to maintain that culture. And these are the departments that are really working toward the restoration of these plants. And so they're, again, they have these seeds and these plants available for restoration projects. So when we think about the values of Native nations of cultural heritage, again, it's not just the tangible plant itself. It's about that sense of feeling or that connection with a location. It's about all the living aspects of tribal culture and their day-to-day life, right? They are trying to maintain that connection to their culture and their elders and to the way they, their ancestors live. So often these plants are referred to as our relatives, and those are our connections to our ancestors. And so, we treat these places and these relatives or these plants very differently than a non-native or a Western perspective. Everything has spirit in Native culture, and so this concept of taking something and putting in a museum, or that you're taking that spirit away from that place, and it's not accepted. You don't take anything from a place. So everything is spiritual. Everything has spirit. There are places for ceremonies and prayer and selection of those places and ceremonies. And you often, so if you were to harvest something, you usually will pray for before you, there's that respect and for, and of a place and what it has, and thinking, for that providing of that, whatever it is you're gathering, of that food, of that medicine. And there are practices on how to do those things. Also, Native nations are very holistic, so they don't separate things into, departments or this siloing type of aspect of treating things for, in separate things separately. That their places are very holistic and thought of in that way. There's also data sovereignty and not sharing of information outside of the tribe, or outside of, what there are certain people in the tribe that obtain or have that information. And so knowledge holders and elders and things like that, that you're not supposed to share, and it's not a timing to share, a season to share. And so things like even stories or songs, you're only supposed to sing or tell that story at a certain time, and it's not supposed to be shared, and it has a purpose. And so, so there's a lot more works toward data sovereignty and data sharing plans, and we even see those in grant proposals as well. And so I think, something that's been really challenging for me here at this Climate Science Center, even though our mission is natural and cultural resources, tribes don't view them as separate. They're one of the same. And so you can't, just work on cultural resources and not consider the natural, or, only think about the natural environment as not cultural. And so these are just some values to keep in mind when working with Native tribes, Native nations. So I wanted to share an example of a tribe. So Eastern Band of Cherokees have a pretty significant, culturally significant plant species initiative. And this map is their historical Cherokee Nation region, right? And so as you can see, it's across many states in the Southeast. And this particular program, they work on restoration and management and utilization of species. they do education and outreach, and they also partner on research. And so I provide the link there as an example of something to check out of a tribal program working on these things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, what types of weather and climate impacts are being discussed about culturally significant plants. So things like, major fires that go over cultural sites or cultural landscapes. So in this case, this is Bandelier National Monument, and there was a major fire in 2011 that went over the monument. That was pretty devastating. And then, not too long later, they had major floods in that region as well. So all this material that was burned and the debris was then also flooded. And one of the things that we talk about with this fire is that the soils were burned so hot that the silica melted in the sediments, and so they're having to remove topsoil and replace it in order to plant anything back and do any kind of restoration. And so that's a whole new, I think, aspect of thinking about and what the cost would be for restoration. So, impacts from extreme weather, whether it's tree impacts, we know about fallen trees and ice and debris. Investing in debris removal from cultural areas and cultural landscapes is often talked about. Hail impacts to vegetation is another one. Another few things that we talk about is a lot of the cultural and medicinal plants are getting harder to find. And so when we talk to elders, they're really concerned about this. And when they go back to their places that they've collected for, for decades, or even that these things are not present. And so, so they're very interested in understanding why this is happening and what to do about it. And so, for example, this is the U.S. Forest Service has these products where they're looking at shifts in tree species in the Southeast. So as you can see, some of these species are moving north and significant are projected to, maple syrup and maple production for the tribes in the Northeast are moving into Canada. And then, some of these species that we will see a lot less of and whether in some areas. And so here in Oklahoma, we're on the western extent of some of those species, like I mentioned, the hickories earlier with the stickball. And so those are getting really hard to find in some areas. And then also talking about phenological changes to plants. So the effects to timing of when harvesting happens, and something that, they've done this practice for, decades or generations. And they have these very local place-based knowledge of harvesting times and calendars. And that's not the same now. And so having to be reactive and getting out when they can to harvest and things, which often also affects the timing of ceremonies and versus, calendar dates of when we, so a strawberry ceremony when the strawberries are ready, for example. So that's become a big discussion about these observations that they're seeing. So a little more on, if we lose these plants, we're losing the cultural heritage. We're losing that connection to our ancestors and our spiritual connections, connections to our social and cultural traditions, either historic traditions or current day traditions. Many of these sites are impacting our tourism departments and our economic in these communities. It's also an opportunity for us to understand how these communities adapted in past climates and over time. And so learning from the way they made these decisions and how they might traditionally adapt, and how that works in that process. It's losing our language, and so our languages are based off of those places that we are homelands and around, and so many of our words, are related to those local places and landscapes and plants and our traditions. So losing that connection to our language, cultural landscapes and ways of life. And then I just put this quote in here: loss of cultures and languages results in lost language of the plant world, uses of the plant, and the traditional ecological knowledge. And so in what I'm basically saying is it's really about our identity as Native people. And as you can see here, there's lots of different tribes and lots of different cultures. And so it really is about, that for us is that it is about our identity. So what can we do about it, or what some of the tribes talking about and doing in this? So they're really starting to think about longer term site management and coming up with plans for these sites. They're talking about including cultural resources in emergency management plans, right? So disaster preparedness and response and damage assessments, and really looking at things that can include and use that funding for mitigation to restore cultural sites and cultural plants. They're talking about, more discussions about protecting sites from impacts, hard or soft protections, and really thinking about redefining of what protection looks like. So I was in a conversation yesterday about mapping seed gathering sites and the need to think about what types of sites we're protecting, and is it the biodiverse sites or the sites that there's very few seeds of that species left, and sort of practices around those sites and who has access to those sites. There's a lot more talk about vulnerability assessments and climate adaptation plans for these things. A lot more discussion about monitoring these sites. So when we talked about the seeds collection sites, we're talking about how do we monitor for these things of how climate change is impacting these things. Getting phenology data, for example, and different types of really interesting discussions around monitoring. Creating buffer zones around culturally significant plants and areas. And so that's been one discussion I've had with river cane, for example. A lot more focus on building tribal capacity in climate change for these things as well, and need for technical assistance and trainings. So I wanted to also share that the National Park Service has really taken a lead on cultural resources climate change, and they have a strategy, and so they obviously work a lot with tribes and on their national parks, and so they're really, this strategy really has some interesting aspects of thinking about these cultural resources and research as well. So I wanted to share a few types of research projects that are being done. So the National Park Service, we have a pretty large group. We meet monthly and talk with researchers about cultural resources and climate change. We're planning another webinar series this year. We're also talking about training the National Park Service staff on cultural resources and climate change. So lots of good interaction and opportunities there. With our center here at the South Central, we have a project called Time to Restore, connecting people, plants, and pollinators. And so these are some of the gaps in the information. So we're trying to provide climate-informed guidance on these, pollinator species and identifying which species are of concern and what climate change may mean for them and what we can do. And so having lots of stakeholder engagement workshops. Some of the questions here that we're trying to answer about, what species, and then thinking about, when to collect plants and gather seeds and the blooming times, and, maybe even controlling that, like planting so that there's always something blooming and available for the butterflies or the monarchs specifically when they migrate. Thinking about timing of harvest seeds and when those things are available, and how that's going to change. And so there's some really interesting discussions around with these groups. There are, as I mentioned, tribes that are doing vulnerability assessments for culturally significant plants. And so the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is one of those. And so I wanted to share that with you guys, that they've been looking at things like wild rice and how vulnerable that is to climate change, and really starting to identify what kinds of adaptation options or actions can be done in a cultural way. So this is definitely a great resource example to look at. Another project is the tribal adaptation menu. This was done with NIAX and the Forest Service. And so they basically took some of the climate adaptation menus and frameworks and they indigenized it. So they included their indigenous and traditional knowledge and their cultural practices, and they identified what their adaptations might be. And so they really put a focus on the non-human relationships and approaching knowledge holders, and including these knowledge holders and elders in their planning processes and discussions. And so this is one of the best, one of my favorite products out there that's coming out of the tribes. So I have a project to do a culturally significant plants and climate change event. And so I wanted to share that with you guys as well. So it's currently being planned for March 22nd through 24th. It's going to be in Chickasaw country here in Oklahoma, in Sulphur, Oklahoma. And you're more than welcome to apply, and if you're interested. And so I provide the link there. But a little more about the event. We are expecting, we're planning for 150 people, primarily focused here in the South Central, but we have quite a few people from all across the country coming in. And the idea is to bring together the tribal staff, the ethnobotanists, the elders, and the natural cultural resource staff, and then the terrestrial plant ecologists like you guys together to have discussions about climate change and climate research. And so the goal is to identify opportunities for collaboration. So what are the low-hanging fruit, the research questions, the opportunities to develop collaboration. And so we'll have quite a bit of World Cafe discussions on these topics. And then the types of things that we're potentially hoping for is maybe some case studies or research working groups that are going to work together and maybe go after some funding or publication or something like that is the idea. And it's really focused on, identifying research needs. Here at our center, we also have a couple other things that you might be interested in. We have a rangelands and climate change workshop webinar series coming up in February. And so you're more than welcome to attend that. It's open. And then we're going to be doing a fire and climate change series focused on working with tribes as well. And that's with the Forest Service Southern Region. So from Virginia to Florida to Oklahoma and Texas. So that's definitely And that will be opening for registration here in a few weeks. So with that, I would be more than happy to answer questions if we have time.
Yes, it looks like we've got one in the chat, and then I also have a bunch. So Yolanda Lopez asks, are Native people adapting or using new crop varieties developed, I'm guessing from non-Native sources?
So there are quite a few groups. So there, if you're familiar with the climate service organizations, there's the USDA climate hubs. And so there's one tribal liaison in the Southwest out of El Paso, Helena Deswood, and she works with the tribal ag stakeholders. And so there's a lot of regenerative ag and climate smart ag practices. And so understanding sort of where, so there are some tribes that are known to be ag tribes, right? That are doing actual crops, right? And raising things. And so, but I would say a lot of tribes are more about their traditional foods, right? So they're growing their specific crops, but yeah, I do think there's definitely some tribes that are doing climate adaptation for crops or traditional foods out there. So.
Okay. Another question from Lacey is, thank you so much for your talk, very informative. Who or what institutions work on advocacy at the national policy level for all the needs that you're sharing with us?
So the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, we are, the way I explain them is we're half consortium university led and half USGS led. And so on the CAS side, we do some advocacy for funding. There's actually quite a bit of funding and a lot of talk about plus ups and budgets and things this year and with the infrastructure bill. So there's quite a bit of work and opportunities for these things. As far as advocacy groups, there's quite a few. The Union of Concerned Scientists does a lot of advocacy. There are tribal groups that do a lot of advocacy. So there's the National Congress of American Indians that the tribal leaders, and they have a working group, and they have a tribal climate change leader summit every year that they basically make policy recommendations and meet with Congress. There's another group called Rising Voices out of UCAR in Colorado that does tribal policy. And so they have different themes and different groups. And so, for example, with tribal relocation or retreat, that's a big one right now that's getting a lot of traction and being talked about. And so, just there's lots of different things out there. I could go on and on about that.
Right. So you mentioned that it's a lot about where the plants are growing that makes them significant for the different cultures and the different people. So my question is how would Native people view plant improvement where the options to preserve a particular species are very limited? One example that comes to mind is the American chestnut. That species was wiped out by a very devastating disease, and there's very limited options to work on it. And one of the options that scientists are using is genetic engineering. And so I was curious what the perspective would be of Native people with help and what forms of help that they would appreciate.
So I will say, there's definitely concerns and depends on the species and what the use is for, right? But the chestnut, the tribes are very interested in the chestnut and work around that. And there's actually tribal groups around that and interest. And so there's quite a few groups that are primarily led by the U.S. Forest Service in the southeastern region, and their ethnobotanist, Michelle Baumfleck. But yeah, they even hire Native interns to work on chestnut stuff. I see all sorts of interesting things that come across that. We haven't had that discussion about climate change and chestnut necessarily, or with that group. And with the genetics and stuff, that's definitely something you're starting to see more with tribes. And I think it just depends on how culturally significant it is and what, and how vulnerable it is. One example that comes to mind is the Salish Kootenai have been working and partnering doing some amazing work with the white bark pine. And so it's a very significant, and it rose to the top of, it's very vulnerable to climate change. And so, that's one of the reasons why they chose to really make it a focus of their climate adaptation planning. But they're doing all sorts of genetics and research, and they've got this amazing little video of like this bird that goes down, and they visit all the different site pieces. And so they go to the labs and the genetic labs, and they meet with the scientist, and then they go to each piece to make sure to tell the story of how they're working and partnering to restore these white bark pine. And it's really cool to see that happening. And so I do think there are opportunities to have those discussions. I think it would really require a good working partnership and collaboration in order to see if there's interest and for those things to occur. But yeah, there's some really cool work that's happening in those areas.
One of our attendees asked about your culturally significant plant symposium. Will it be in person or will it be virtual?
So it will be in person. Currently, we are thinking that if we, for example, with COVID, like if we don't have as many as we would have liked, or the tribal staff, that we will record it and then offer it online as a second option later, that we won't do a hybrid is what we've been deciding. Hopefully in the next week or two, we have backup dates. So we already moved it once from January. And so we will make that decision of whether we're going to go forward with the March dates here in a couple weeks. And then, but as you know, as plant people, if we move it to June, which is our backup dates, then that's field season and gathering season, and plant people aren't, they're very busy during that time. So I've heard a lot of people tell me they'd rather go with the March dates, but we'll see. But yeah, definitely reach out and if you're interested.
All right, another question I have is, how is the easiest way for us as students that are kind of in a bubble within academia? What's the easiest way for us to connect with Native nations and perhaps share knowledge or work together?
So there's gatekeepers, sort of people like me, tribal liaisons, right? That are really important, or for different areas, or like the climate hub tribal liaisons, right? Depending on what it is. So making those connections of sort of those people that have those relationships with the tribes and aware of what's going on. Another thing is attending conferences. So there are lots of Native conferences. So U.S. Forest Service hosts one called To Bridge a Gap that's coming up in March, and the Choctaws are hosting it this year. And it's a great opportunity to present to your researcher, have abstracts or sessions, and pitch projects and and see what kind of interest and network. You know, as researchers and scientists, that's what we do. We go to conferences and we present, right? Like, there's lots of funding. You know, partnering with tribes on, you know, on a grant proposal. And so, you know, collaborating to go after funding for something that's beneficial for them too, or that they can support, and provide letters of support and things like that. There's so many opportunities to work with tribal communities on, you know, plants and climate change. And
Right. So one question that I have, it kind of shifts the theme, the topic a little bit, is on maybe the work that tribal and native people do for feeding their own families. How fragile is their systems to produce food for their own families, or are they not as much reliant on their own production? And what can you say about that?
So it depends on the community. So there are obviously some communities that are very, you know, traditional, that still practice and live and have native farmers, right, and that are producing at the scale for their community or for their families, right, and rely on that. And there are, you know, the USDA actually has quite a few tribal organizations and support for those types of native producers, native and native foods and different things, food sovereignty and farm bill, and they have tribal liaisons for all those things. I do think there, that is something that does exist. But for most communities, especially in today's, after, you know, colonization and settlement and our histories here in the US, it's really about revitalizing some of that and maintaining that and education of their citizens. And it's not for, you know, the extent of what you're talking about, whether it's, you know, food for their community. There's a lot of talk about, and so I didn't catch all of the previous speakers, but food deserts and food availability and local foods, and how to bring that back in some of their communities, and especially with COVID and supply and things like that this year. The USDA, which was interesting, had these grants that were available for tribes to provide food during COVID. And so every tribe, you know, around me here was having regular and providing food during COVID. And it was really interesting to see that happen, and that the tribes were getting those fundings for. And so they were popping up everywhere and in very rural communities all across Oklahoma for sure. And so when that happened, and so the interesting thing that I think we've learned a lot from COVID this year is the tribes, you know, everything became COVID mission critical, and really redirected all of their staff to really providing to their community, to their citizens. And they were reassigned, and they were, you know, it became the focus, and it wasn't, you know, about what your job is or what you were hired, but where the need is. And they really led and took a very different approach to that. And I still get emails that I'm still serving for COVID, and I'm not able to answer your emails or work in environmental or things. You know, even so epidemiology, when we have tribal IRBs, institutional review boards for research, where they were so focused on COVID and CARES money and COVID related research grants, that they have not been reviewing grants or grant research for other things. And so, you know, and with the numbers back up, I've been getting those emails back, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. Definitely a challenge when it comes to working with researchers.
All right. Thank you so much, April, for taking some time to share with us. It was definitely eye-opening and a very unique perspective.